Have you ever wondered why certain moments still hurt, even years later? Why a tone, a glance, or a passing comment continues to echo in your mind long after it should have faded? It's because not all pain is loud or dramatic. Some of the deepest wounds are quiet. They come from subtle dismissals, cold silences, offhand mockery, or moments of neglect that seem small at the time but burrow deep into your sense of self. You might not even remember exactly what was said, but your nervous system does. It remembers the discomfort, the humiliation, the rejection, and now you carry it in your hesitation to speak, your tendency to overthink, your fear of being too much or not enough. What makes this kind of pain so persistent is that it didn't come from monsters. It came from people who didn't know better, people who were emotionally blind, distracted, or just repeating the patterns they inherited themselves. They weren't necessarily cruel, but they were careless with their words, their presence, their silence. And their carelessness left you with questions you never asked for. Am I unworthy? Am I too sensitive? What did I do wrong? Over time, those questions stopped sounding like questions and started sounding like truth. But what if they were never yours to begin with? What if the pain you carry isn't a reflection of who you are, but of who they weren't capable of being? Not evil, just unaware. Not malicious, just emotionally immature. The kind of ignorance that wounds without realizing it. That's the pain so many people carry, the invisible kind that seeps into identity. It doesn't feel big enough to name, but it's heavy enough to shape your entire sense of self. And we carry it, not because we chose it, but because we were too young or too loyal to question it. So maybe it's time to ask the question no one asked back then. What if that pain wasn't something you created, but something that was planted in you? Because the truth is, when pain is planted in you by others, it often wasn't out of malice, it was out of ignorance. Not intellectual ignorance, but emotional, the kind that comes from never learning how to reflect, how to pause before reacting, how to hold space for someone else's emotions without turning it into a threat. This is what we mean by emotional stupidity, not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of empathy, self-awareness, and emotional responsibility. Psychologist Daniel Goleman called this missing skill emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions while being attuned to the emotions of others. Many people in your life, maybe even those closest to you, never developed this. They could function in society, make decisions, give advice, but they couldn't sit with discomfort, admit when they were wrong, or notice how their words or tone chipped away at your sense of safety. When they felt overwhelmed, they deflected. When they felt ashamed, they blamed. And when you needed them to pause and see you, they looked the other way. Low EQ individuals often don't realize the harm they cause because they lack the inner mirrors to see themselves clearly. Instead of asking, "Why did I react that way?" they ask, "What's wrong with you?" Instead of listening, they dismiss. Over time, you begin to absorb that pattern. You start to wonder if maybe you are too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. But you weren't. You were just in an environment where your emotions were inconvenient to someone who never learned how to handle their own. What makes emotional stupidity so dangerous is that it doesn't always look harmful. It hides behind roles like parent, partner, mentor, and wears the mask of normalcy. But underneath, it quietly offloads emotional tension onto everyone nearby. And by the time you realize what's happening, the damage has already been done. Because when someone keeps hurting you, not out of cruelty, but out of unconsciousness, it still leaves a mark. And that mark stays with you, long after they've forgotten what they said. But it didn't stop with projection. It changed how you see yourself. Because when someone doesn't know how to carry their own emotional weight, they find someone else to carry it for them. That's how projection works. Instead of confronting their shame, they shame you. Instead of owning their fear, they control you. Instead of grieving their lost dreams, they mock yours. They offload what they can't accept in themselves and hand it to you like it was always yours to begin with. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the part of ourselves we refuse to see. He wrote, "Whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as projection." In other words, what someone can't deal with internally, they push onto others. And often that other is the closest person to them, the child, the partner, the friend who doesn't know better than to absorb it. Their anger becomes your tension. Their insecurity becomes your silence. Their self-hatred becomes your self-doubt. Think about the parent who constantly criticized you, not because you were flawed, but because they couldn't accept their own imperfections. Or the teacher who made you feel small, not because you lacked potential, but because they had stopped believing in their own. Or the friend who rolled their eyes when you dared to dream big, because deep down, they had already given up on themselves. And when someone you trust or love projects their pain onto you, it hits differently. It bypasses logic. It goes straight into your identity. At first, you might resist it. You might try to tell yourself, that's not true. But over time, the repetition wears you down. You begin to adapt to their version of reality, not because it's accurate, but because it's familiar. You edit yourself to avoid setting them off. You shrink yourself so they can feel bigger. And you start to believe things about yourself that were never yours to believe. That you're a burden, that you're not enough, that your voice should stay quiet. None of that pain belonged to you, but you carried it anyway. And the longer you carry it, the harder it becomes to separate their wounds from your worth. That's the danger of projection. It doesn't just distort how they see you, it distorts how you begin to see yourself. And the most tragic part, you thought it was your fault, because when someone projects their pain onto you long enough, when they keep repeating the same dismissive, shaming, or belittling responses, you start to absorb it. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is wired to adapt. What's repeated becomes familiar, and what's familiar starts to feel true. This is how emotional ignorance seeps into identity. It doesn't arrive with proof. It arrives with frequency. Over time, the phrases they used, "You're too sensitive," "You always overreact," "You'll never be enough," stop sounding like opinions and start echoing as facts. Your nervous system, trying to protect you, begins to code those moments as danger. Your brain builds shortcuts. Don't speak up, don't take up space, don't be too emotional. That's not personality, it's programming. Neural conditioning isn't just some abstract theory. It's how your brain hardwires emotional survival into behavioral habits. And when you're constantly adapting to someone else's emotional limitations, those habits don't look like trauma. They look like your personality. So you become the peacekeeper, the overachiever, the one who never needs help. You rehearse how to make yourself smaller, quieter, easier to love. You try to anticipate their moods, edit your words, and carry guilt that was never yours to carry, just to avoid more of the same pain. Emotional stupidity didn't just affect how they treated you, it shaped how you began to treat yourself. You silenced your needs before anyone else could. You criticized yourself before anyone else had the chance. You stopped expecting support because you learned it wouldn't come. And the worst part is that none of this was random. It was learned, conditioned, repeated, normalized, until you didn't even recognize it as damage. You just called it who I am. But that identity, that's not your truth. It's a mask built from the emotional blindness of others. A mask you wore for so long, it started to feel like your face. But understanding this isn't enough. We need to talk about how deep the damage really goes. Because when someone hurts you repeatedly, especially someone you're supposed to trust, the mind doesn't always look outward for the cause. It looks inward. Instead of asking, why did they treat me that way? You ask, what did I do wrong? This is one of the quiet tragedies of emotional harm, especially when it comes from a parent, a partner, or someone you depended on. You start to believe that if something feels wrong, you must be the reason for it. This isn't weakness, it's survival. In childhood, especially, the need for connection overrides the need for truth. When your safety or sense of belonging depends on someone who mistreats you, your brain makes a painful trade. It chooses guilt over abandonment, because if the problem is you, then maybe, just maybe, you can fix it. You can try harder, be better, stay quiet, stay small. That illusion of control feels safer than facing the truth that the people you relied on couldn't meet your emotional needs. This is how attachment trauma works. It doesn't always come from overt abuse. Sometimes, it comes from emotional inconsistency, from being loved one moment and criticized the next, from never knowing which version of someone you were going to get. And in that emotional chaos, guilt becomes your anchor. You start believing you're the reason for the dysfunction, even if no one ever said it out loud. What's even more painful is that this kind of guilt lingers long after the relationship ends, long after you've left the home, changed cities, built a new life. You might still feel the urge to apologize for things that weren't your fault, to shrink when someone raises their voice, to feel guilty for saying no, or for needing rest, or for simply taking up space. That's not your guilt, it's residue, leftover emotion from someone else's inability to own their behavior. And many people live their entire lives with this weight on their backs, never realizing it was never theirs to carry. Guilt passed down like an heirloom, shame wrapped in silence, responsibility for things they never caused, but still feel the need to fix. But guilt was only the beginning, because the pain didn't just settle in your mind, it rewired how you lived. And once you're hurt enough, you begin to hurt yourself in their place. Because the pain you carry wasn't caused by one violent storm, it was a slow erosion, not one big explosion, but a steady drip. Day after day, moment after moment. That's the cruelty of emotional trauma. It doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it whispers, in the sharpness of a joke that wasn't funny, in the silence that follows when you needed someone to care, in the parent whose phone was always more important, the partner who sighed instead of asking what was wrong, the friend who changed the subject when you opened your heart. Nothing huge, nothing headline-worthy, but over time, it accumulates. It scars. This is what psychologists call complex trauma, or CPTSD. It's not rooted in one catastrophic event. It's built from a pattern of emotional dismissals, invalidations, and betrayals that leave you questioning your worth. And the worst part? It's often invisible, because when no one hits you, when no one yells, people assume you're fine. They don't see how your sense of self was slowly shattered by 1,000 tiny dismissals, how every time your feelings were minimized, a part of you started to shrink in response. You start doubting your reactions. You learn not to cry, not to ask, not to expect anything from anyone. You become hyper-independent or chronically anxious. You struggle to trust others, not because you're broken, but because you were never given a safe space to exist without judgment. Over time, this pattern seeps into your identity. You begin to internalize the message that your emotions are too much, that your needs are inconvenient, and that love must always come with pain. This kind of trauma is like emotional sandpaper. It doesn't leave one clear wound. It wears you down until you're raw and don't even know why. And perhaps the most tragic part is how normalized it becomes. You stop seeing it as abuse. You start seeing it as life. So how do we break this chain? Before we even get to that, we have to admit something painful, that by the time those people were done with us, we no longer needed them to hurt us. We learned to do it ourselves. Somewhere along the line, their voices became ours. The cutting remarks, the silent disapproval, the constant dismissal, all of it became the lens through which we see ourselves now. You may have walked away from them physically, but emotionally, they moved in and made a home in your mind. That's the twisted legacy of emotional ignorance. When the wounds aren't healed, they don't just linger, they evolve. And eventually, you start behaving in ways that mimic the pain you were once subjected to. You sabotage relationships that feel too safe, because safety feels unfamiliar. You criticize yourself relentlessly, echoing the tone of those who never saw your worth. You push away opportunities because you're terrified of being seen, of being celebrated, because somewhere deep down, a part of you still believes you're not worthy. You might find yourself trapped in toxic relationships, not because you want to suffer, but because pain feels more familiar than peace. Or maybe you avoid love, success, joy, not because you don't crave them, but because your nervous system has been trained to expect the other shoe to drop. What once was someone else's dysfunction becomes your pattern. Their shame becomes your identity. Their projections become your beliefs. And now, you do to yourself what they once did to you. Dismiss your feelings, downplay your dreams, silence your instincts. This isn't weakness. It's a survival response that got stuck. And it's heartbreaking, because the moment you start turning your pain inward, the cycle completes. You become the carrier of a wound that was never yours to begin with. And unless you bring it into the light, you'll keep bleeding into every space you enter. Relationships, goals, self-talk, all of it shadowed by echoes of their ignorance. But what if you didn't have to keep reenacting pain that was passed down to you like a curse? That's where the real rebellion begins. Not in lashing out, but in healing. Because choosing to heal when you were never taught how to love yourself isn't just a recovery, it's a revolution. It means interrupting generations of emotional blindness. It means refusing to live as the echo of someone else's pain. And it starts by reclaiming what was quietly stolen from you. Your trust in your own voice, your right to feel deeply, your permission to exist without shame. This is where the healing begins, in the unlearning, in recognizing that not all the thoughts in your head are yours, in identifying the beliefs that were planted in you but never truly belong, in speaking back to the internalized voices that echo things you would never say to someone you love. You start becoming the parent, the protector, the nurturer you never had, not to fix the past, but to reclaim authority over your present. But this healing is more than just restoration, it's evolution. Because every time you pause instead of react, every time you validate your feelings instead of silencing them, every time you choose reflection over projection, you become the very thing they never were. Emotionally intelligent, present, courageous. You don't need revenge, you need clarity. You need the quiet power that comes from no longer needing their recognition to define your worth. And when that clarity deepens, something unexpected begins to take shape. Not just distance from the past, but a different relationship to it. One where you stop carrying their weight as your identity and start letting go of what was never yours to hold. Forgiveness, in this light, isn't a favor to them. It's a release for you. It's not about pretending what they did was okay. It's about understanding that their actions were a reflection of their emotional limitations, not your value. And in that moment of realization, you loosen the grip they've had on your story. You begin living from a different center, not one rooted in defense, but in depth. You don't undo their legacy by proving them wrong. You undo it by refusing to repeat it. You become the emotional adult they were too afraid to be. You ask the questions they avoided. You admit when you're wrong. You choose presence over pride. You create space for love that doesn't come with conditions or control. And that is the true transformation. This is the part they were never strong enough to reach, but you are. You didn't choose their wounds, but you're choosing something they never did, to face them. And that changes everything, because while the pain wasn't your fault, the healing will always be your responsibility. Not because it's fair, not because you deserve the hurt, but because no one else can reclaim the life that was nearly stolen from you. Healing is the quiet act of defiance that says, you don't get to have the final word. It's hard, it's lonely. Sometimes it feels like you're doing emotional cleanup for damage you didn't cause. But the alternative, staying stuck in pain that was never yours to begin with, is far more brutal. Healing doesn't erase the past, it reshapes the future. You're not here because you're broken. You're here because you're brave enough to break the cycle. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said that stupidity is more dangerous than evil because it resists correction. It cannot be reasoned with. But you're doing the most courageous thing of all. You're choosing to see, to reflect, to feel. You're allowing light into the parts of yourself that were shadowed by someone else's ignorance. And that's how the cycle ends. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe your pain an explanation. What you owe yourself is peace, permission to grow, permission to love without fear of repeating the past, and permission to rewrite the story, not with vengeance, but with wisdom. Their ignorance does not get to define the rest of your life, and neither does the pain they pass down, because you're allowed, right now, in this very moment, to release what was never yours to carry. The shame, the guilt, the second guessing. You're allowed to stop rehearsing their words in your head and start speaking to yourself with the kindness they never offered. This journey hasn't been easy. You've peeled back old wounds, looked closely at truths you were never taught to name, and stepped into a kind of honesty most people avoid their entire lives. That alone is proof of your strength, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet kind that reshapes legacies. So here's your reminder. You are not broken, you were hurt, and now you're healing. If this message stayed with you, If something finally clicked or softened inside, drop a comment below with, "I'm letting go of what was never mine." Let it be a declaration, a starting point. And if you're ready to keep walking this path, to keep choosing awareness over autopilot, truth over silence, and healing over inheritance, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more powerful insights like this.